Good morning. Let's do the news roundup. First up, we had this. This is a infograph of the gas pipelines that come through Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have said that they will not be allowing Russian gas to come through Ukraine into Europe from the end of 2024. There seems to be a growing disdain for Western Europe from Ukraine, which I completely understand, to be honest with you, because let's face it, we have sent them to die in this war, given them really the bare minimum of older equipment, and sent vast sums of our own money to the usually American military industrial complex to replace the old equipment that we've sent to Ukraine. And it's costing them their country. So I'm actually not at all surprised that the Ukrainians have said that they will stop this. But I do hope that people just start to realise that this disdain for the West from Ukraine will grow. And when it does, the Ukrainians, just like the Chechens, who, by the way, have said some very mad stuff in the last couple of days, are going to see the West as a threat, with all of those long-range missiles and all of those tanks and all of that armour that we have given them, with a land border with Europe, which I've been saying since March, even February 2022. This is a huge threat to Europe. And they keep on making statements which show their disdain for Europe, and that's only going to grow. So be aware of what's happening. This was quite interesting. Your experts say that the US military might be preparing for an official withdrawal from Iraq and possibly Syria because of the election happening next year and the growing issues in America with the government's foreign policy and the amount that it's costing the American people. Now, I think this is excellent news for Syria and Iraq, and I also think it's probably why we're seeing the Turkish making a lot of statements about staying in Syria, because obviously this has come up in conversation somewhere, hasn't it? I don't think that the Turks will stay in Syria when their big American mates go home, but we shall see. Apparently, the CIA warned Secretary of State Antony Blinken that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will not succeed, and this is broken by Seymour Hersh, who cites his sources within the CIA. He learned from the agency that the Ukrainian offensive would not work. It was a show staged by Zelensky, and some in the administration believed his nonsense. And quite interestingly, there's been a number of staging incidents in Ukraine in the last couple of days, like they've claimed there's some big offensive in a certain direction, and the Russians have kind of responded with, there's actually been no signs of any offensive in those directions for some time. It seems that Zelensky is clutching at straws. There was an article about the Defense Secretary of Ukraine wanting them to start mining Odessa, and Zelensky said absolutely not, because that will show that we're defending rather than attacking, and he's still trying to convince people that they're going to take Crimea this year. So this is what you get when you have a performer as your president rather than a military man or someone who at least understands economics. It's very, very clear that Zelensky's main focus is on how this looks to the West rather than what's really going on the ground in Ukraine. And the Americans are saying clearly now that it's Biden who has caused the stalling of Ukraine's offensive, and that their intention was to slow the Russians moving west rather than actually defeat the Russians. And And that falls very much in line with this idea that it's about weakening the Russian military, which it hasn't happened, rather than actually defending Ukraine. And we are seeing this. We are seeing that the Ukrainians have never, ever had the chance to actually manage this. Perhaps if they'd had every ounce of long-range weapon and whatnot from the beginning, they would have had more of a shot. But even then, I just don't think it's possible to beat the Russian army on their doorstep. I just don't. I know that everyone says, "Oh, what was it? Someone said the other day that that NATO will rush in at the end and defeat Russia." I just don't think that that's possible. I'm not convinced that that's something that we're going to see. And if that is the mindset of people, that you will destroy an entire country of men in order to rush in at the end, that is a really horrendous place to go to, I think. So I hope that this can be dealt with in a different way, because this war has been a disaster for us. The Financial Times has done an article talking about how the Russians have changed essentially the price it costs to move oil in order to create a loophole around the fuel cap. And I think that this is probably pretty obvious that they would do something like this. And it does make a lot of sense. The Dutch economy is officially in a recession. I think most of Europe is in a recession. I certainly think the UK is in a recession. I certainly think America's in a recession. But what we're witnessing is a clear fabrication of figures. They're being misrepresented to try and show that, our currencies are strong and therefore things are more expensive. It's just a recession by another name. And the problem with this sort of hyperinflation, in order to try and not showcase recession, is that it will come crashing down. The Eastern countries seem to at least be accepting that they're, struggling financially in some ways, but here in the West, we are just all about how it looks and not about the substance of what it means. The UN will take part in the BRICS summit. The level of representation is being specified. I can understand this because I think that the Russians and perhaps even the Africans as well, and certainly the Chinese, believe that there's some hope for the UN to do some good. But I have very, very little faith in the UN's intentions in Africa. I think they've proven themselves to be the very opposite of what they suggest that they are. And, hopefully this will make that clearer, more than anything. This is interesting. In Poland, they're afraid that Lukashenko will interfere in the elections. And this is from Polski Radio. This is what the Polish have been doing for years. I can't recall an election in Belarus that has not been attacked by the Poles. I've even had Polish people defending that in my comments. It's so normal to them to interfere with the elections of Poland. For what it's worth, as far as I'm aware, the Belarusians have simply said, look, we just don't want to have bad relations with our neighbours. Something I think that the Polish could probably learn from. Western media now suggesting that the mistakes made in Vietnam and Afghanistan are being repeated in Ukraine, and this is softly preparing us for the impending defeat of Ukraine and withdrawal of NATO and mercenary forces. I'm seeing a definite shift in the mindset of the journalists, who we all know provide the information that they're told to, away from more and more escalation and into a probably quite chaotic retreat, I would think, like Vietnam and Afghanistan. Already the end of part 1, sorry.